The morning they brought the bulldozers, 81-year-old Marguerite Calloway stood barefoot in the frost-wet grass in her nightgown, aiming her late husband's shotgun at a $900,000 excavator. And behind her, in the barns and burrows and hollow trees she'd spent 40 years turning into a sanctuary, 300 rescued animals had no idea their whole world was about to be torn out by the roots. This is the story of Marguerite Margo Calloway and the 12 acres in the hill country outside Sweetwater, Tennessee, that the county called blighted land and she called home. Margo hadn't set out to build a sanctuary. In 1979, she and her husband Walter bought the old Prout orchard, 40 rows of apple and pear trees gone half wild after years of neglect for almost nothing, because nothing about it was easy. The soil was rocky. The well ran dry twice a summer, but Walter had grown up 2 hollows over, and he said the land remembered him, and that was that. For 15 years it was just an orchard. Walter grafted new limbs onto old rootstock, the way his grandfather taught him, and Margo made pies for the church bake sales that people drove 45 minutes for. Then, on a June afternoon in 1994, a neighbor boy showed up at their gate holding a shoebox with 3 orphaned raccoon kits inside, their mother killed on the county road. He didn't know what else to do with them. Margo didn't either, but she said yes. That was the beginning. Word travels slow, and then all at once in rural Tennessee. Within 2 years, Margo had an informal understanding with the county animal control officer, the local vet, and half the farmers in 3 townships. If something was hurt, orphaned, or unwanted and too wild for a shelter to place, you brought it to the Calloways. A red-tailed hawk with a shattered wing, a litter of bobcat kittens whose mother had been shot as a nuisance, goats and pot-bellied pigs abandoned when their novelty wore off, a blind mule named Chester that nobody else wanted. Walter built the enclosures. Margo learned the medicine, real medicine, the kind you get from books and from a veterinarian named Dr. Ruth Acaffer, who drove out from Knoxville twice a month and eventually stopped charging. By the time Walter died of a heart attack in the orchard itself, in 2009, collapsed between 2 Grimes golden apple trees he'd grafted with his own hands, the Calloway place had become something the county had never officially named or recognized. A full working wildlife rehabilitation sanctuary, unlicensed, unfunded, and entirely dependent on one aging widow's stubbornness. She kept it going alone. That's the part people found hardest to believe later, that a woman in her 70s was still mixing formula for orphaned fawns at 4 in the morning, still climbing into pens to change dressings on owls with broken wings, still driving her ancient Ford pickup to the feed store every single week with a list that never got any shorter. By the time the county came for the land in 2023, Margo was caring for over 300 animals: deer, foxes, a one-eyed barn owl named Roosevelt who'd become something of a local celebrity after a photograph of him made its way around social media, goats too old to be useful to anyone but her. And underneath all of it still, the orchard gnarled, half-wild, dropping more apples than any human being could ever eat, feeding animals that no longer had anywhere else in the world to go. The trouble started the way trouble usually starts in small counties, with money and with paperwork nobody had bothered to keep straight. The Calloway land, it turned out, had never been properly rezoned when Walter and Margo stopped treating it purely as agricultural. A regional developer, Briarstone Partners, had been quietly buying up parcels along the ridge for a planned subdivision, 40 new homes, a private road, a name like Sweetwater Ridge Estates stenciled onto a glossy rendering. The Calloway property sat almost dead center of the plan. And because Margo had never filed for nonprofit status, never registered as a rehabilitation facility with the state, never done any of the bureaucratic things that would have made her sanctuary legally visible, the county's records showed exactly what Briarstone's lawyers wanted them to show: an elderly widow illegally hoarding livestock and wildlife on unpermitted structures, in violation of half a dozen county ordinances nobody in Sweetwater had enforced in 30 years. The The county issued a condemnation notice. Briarstone offered Margo $60,000 for 12 acres worth, by the developer's own appraisal, closer to $900,000. She refused. They came anyway. The morning of the bulldozers, a young reporter named Danny Osai from the Knoxville paper's regional desk happened to be the one who got the call, not because his editor thought it mattered, but because it was a slow news day and widow with a shotgun made for a good headline. What Danny found when he got there changed the story entirely. He found Margo, yes, still in her nightgown, still holding Walter's old shotgun unloaded. It turned out, though nobody standing in that yard knew that at the time. But behind her, he found something the county's paperwork had never once mentioned. Pens of red foxes recovering from mange. A pond with 3 legless snapping turtles that couldn't survive release. An enclosure holding 11 white-tailed deer, permanently blinded by a chemical spill years before, that had nowhere else on Earth they could live. Roosevelt the owl, watching the whole standoff from a fence post with his one good eye, utterly unbothered, as though he'd seen worse. Danny didn't write the story the developer's PR team had hoped for. He wrote the true one, and true stories, when they're told right, travel. Within 48 hours, the photograph of Margo Calloway standing between a bulldozer and a barn full of blind deer had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Wildlife rehabilitators from 4 states began calling in, offering to testify to the legitimacy and quality of her work. A retired state senator who'd grown up in Sweetwater and remembered Margo's pies from the church bake sales started making phone calls of his own. Dr. Ruth Acaffer, the veterinarian, drove out with 15 years of medical records proving every animal on that property had been documented, treated, and cared for to a standard most licensed facilities would envy. The county, facing a public relations disaster it never saw coming, suspended the condemnation order pending review. Briarstone Partners, suddenly the villain in a story running on television stations across the state, quietly withdrew its bid rather than be photographed bulldozing blind deer on the evening news. But the deeper problem didn't disappear just because the immediate threat did. Margo was 81 years old. She had no succession plan, no legal protections. No guarantee that the next developer, or the next tax reassessment, or her own eventual passing, wouldn't put every animal on that land right back in danger. A GoFundMe organized by strangers who'd seen Danny's article raised enough, in 3 weeks, to finally file for official nonprofit status and bring the whole operation into legal compliance. Dr. Acaffer helped assemble a board. A young wildlife biology graduate named Priya Sundaram, who'd read the story from 3 states away, showed up that spring and never really left, becoming the person Margo had never had, someone to eventually take over. Today, the Calloway Wildlife Sanctuary is a licensed nonprofit. The orchard Walter planted still stands, and the apples still feed animals that would otherwise have nowhere to go. Roosevelt the owl is, as far as anyone can tell, still alive and still unbothered by very much at all. Margo still gets up before dawn. She says she plans to keep doing it until her body tells her otherwise, and probably a little while after that, too. There's something in this story worth sitting with, beyond the drama of a shotgun and a bulldozer. It's easy to assume the animals we can't see are the ones that need us least, that a fox with mange, or a turtle with no legs, or a deer blinded by someone else's carelessness, simply isn't anyone's responsibility once it's out of sight. Margo Calloway spent 40 years operating on the opposite assumption. That responsibility doesn't end where visibility does. Wildlife rehabilitation in America exists almost entirely because of people like her, unpaid, unlicensed for years at a stretch, working out of barns and back pastures because the animals in front of them couldn't wait for the paperwork to catch up. It's estimated there are tens of thousands of injured or orphaned wild animals brought to informal, small-scale rehabbers across the country every single year. most of them cared for by people the public never hears about, on land the public never sees, until, sometimes, a bulldozer shows up and forces the whole hidden world into the light. Margo Calloway didn't build a sanctuary because she set out to be a hero. She built it one shoebox of orphan raccoons at a time, one broken wing at a time, one refusal to look away at a time. And when the moment came that everything she'd built stood in the path of something bigger and better funded and entirely indifferent to what was actually growing on that land, it wasn't a lawyer or a politician who saved it first. It was a photograph of an old woman who wouldn't move, standing between a machine and 300 creatures who had already lost everything once and weren't going to lose it again if she had anything to say about it. Somewhere outside Sweetwater, Tennessee, the apple trees Walter Calloway grafted with his own hands are still standing, and underneath them still, animals that no one else wanted are exactly where they've always been, home.